Hi guys, this is Sasha Townsend. Yesterday I did a presentation for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning at TCC, a Teaching and Learning Showcase on standards-based grading and the lessons that we can learn from standards-based grading. Now, due to time constraints, I had to go really fast, much faster than I would have hoped. But Zoom, or excuse me, the pandemic, and as unfortunate as it is, has some silver lining. It has made the world smaller, and I'm able to share my presentation with the world. So I have decided to break the presentation into a number of pieces so that I can make each of the pieces a little bit more manageable, a little bit less fast-paced, and sort of go through a little bit of the material at a time. This first video is going to be about standards-based grading itself. And then later we'll talk about how standards-based grading was modified for the online environment and how I'm continuing to modify it. And then the lessons that we can take away from this, because it's really not about standards-based grading. Standards-based grading is a means to an end. What it is about learning. It's about student-centered approaches to learning and what we can do differently to better meet our students where they are. So that's what this presentation is about. Thank you for joining me. And this is part one of a video series on standards-based gradings and lessons from standards-based grading. My title is Lessons from Standards-Based Grading, How This Mastery-Based Approach Can Help Us to See Learning Differently. So again, I'm trying to go beyond standards-based grading, but standards-based grading has a lot of lessons to teach us. So this video will be about standards-based grading and what it looks like in my classroom. We'll talk about why most students love standards-based grading and what we can learn from the students that don't love standards-based grading. And then in another video, I'll talk about recreating the standards-based grading model online, the problems that I've had with that, the struggles, the modifications that I've made, the things that I've learned from my students over the past year or so since the pandemic sent us all home. And then finally, we'll talk about major takeaways for everyone, because again, standards-based grading is not the goal. The goal is learning. And the things that we are doing, the ends that we're achieving with standards-based grading are all tied to the research. And what's wonderful about this is that standards-based grading allows us to actually practice what all of that research says actually works. And it allows us to do that with a single model, or, well, it's sort of a hybrid of two models. But we'll talk more about that later. But for now, this video will be about standards-based grading itself. So what is standards-based grading? First of all, it's a mastery-based assessment approach. Sometimes it's called mastery grading. It's probably a better name for it. In mastery grading or standards-based grading, grades are assigned for what are called course standards. This is a collection of mathematical topics and techniques in a math class. They're usually between 25 and 30 course standards in my class. Rather than assigning grades for 3 or 4 exams in a homework grade, I'm assigning grades for individual course standards. Now, in every standards-based grading classroom or mastery grading classroom, the material is broken up into a bunch of little pieces, which we typically call course standards, and then students have the opportunity to earn a new grade on those course standards later. So if they do poorly, that's okay. It's just giving them a temporary snapshot of where they stand as far as their understanding of that issue, or their understanding of that standard, excuse me. But then after they have learned the material better and they've asked some questions and they've studied and they've practiced, they have the opportunity to improve. So everyone does this a little differently. As if you search for standards-based grading or mastery grading online, you will see that sometimes it's just mastery in progress. And I don't know what they call it when the student hasn't made any progress on the standard, but it's sort of a 0 to 2 scale where you either know it or you don't know it, or you kind of know it. Some people will use that. Some people will use a percentage-based scale. Some people will use a 0 to 10 scale. I choose to use a 0 to 4 scale for each of my grades for the standards in my course. It's like a GPA. So 4 represents an A, 3 represents a B, 2 represents a C, 1 is a D, and 0 is an F. But everybody does it differently. But again, what makes standards-based grading is that we have taken the material, broken it up into a bunch of pieces, and allow students to improve their grades through some kind of reassessment process. Now, there are lots of scholarly articles out there about mastery grading. This is maintained by Dr. Matt Townsley. If we click here, we can see a list. I'm going to close some of these tabs here of scholarly articles. Now, I'm not going to go through these articles with you. Several of them are available online, so you can click here if you'd like to. But I just want you to see, I'm just going to scroll down so that you can see that there's a lot of research. This is not something that I made up. They do this in middle school and high school, and they do it in some college classrooms. As I did research about mastery grading or standards-based grading for my courses, I was primarily looking at blogs written by math teachers, also blogs and posts written by physics professors. Math and physics are my primary interests. So I was interested in how people were using this in STEM education. But there's obviously more than one way to do it, and lots of research out there that shows the benefits of standards-based grading and basically how standards-based grading can benefit our students and how to do it well, how to do it so that it does benefit our students as much as possible. So this slide is just a brief overview of why I love standards-based grading. Standards-based grading clarifies expectations. It lets the students know exactly what is expected of them throughout the semester. These are these standards that we expect them to learn. It also focuses student and instructor attention where it's needed. So as the student accumulates grades, we know, well, that the student has mastered this concept, needs work on this concept. And it makes it very clear what the student needs to focus on to improve. And the student can see that in the grade book, and the instructor can see that in the grade book. All of this is on Blackboard in my courses at TCC. It helps the student learn how to learn. As they see that sometimes they're not getting the grades they want, they find out what they need to do differently so that they can master that standard at the level that they're hoping to master it at. So if they're trying to get an A or they're trying to get a B, they quickly figure out what they need to do differently to get that grade that they want. And it helps us hold the students accountable for both their understanding and their final grades in the course. The students get to decide where they want to study and where they want to improve. And we can have a very high bar because we let the students take quizzes over and over. So we don't have to lower the bar in any way just to accommodate people with varying backgrounds. The fact that everyone has the opportunity to start wherever they're at and improve as much as possible, given the necessary logistical and practical constraints of the system, means that every student has the opportunity to improve. And with the faculty support, they can learn as much as possible and improve their understanding of math or science or whatever it is that you're teaching with standards-based grading and improve their final grades in the course. So what does it look like in my classroom? There are about 30 standards in most courses. I'm grading each standard on a 0 to 4 GPA scale, and I have 7 to 10 quizzes per semester and a comprehensive final. So every quiz covers probably 2 to 4 standards. And instead of giving them a quiz grade out of 100% or out of 10 points or something like that, I am giving them a grade of 0 to 4 on every standard on that quiz. So for example, in Calculus 2, the first course standard is basic antidifferentiation rules and U substitution, and what are called the 9 techniques of algebraic manipulation to get an integrand into a form so that our basic rules apply. So the students will see 4 problems. 3 of those 4 problems will be based on the 9 techniques. 1 will be a U substitution problem, and they have to pick the appropriate technique, apply it correctly, and anti-differentiate. I would give them a grade for that standard. And on the same quiz, there might be an integration by parts standard. They'd have 2 integration by parts integrals to evaluate. And then I don't know what the third standard would be. Maybe we would just do those two standards and then the prerequisite standards on that first quiz in Calculus 2. So the students would get 4 grades on that quiz, a grade for the anti-differentiation standard, 1 for integration by parts, and then 1 for prerequisites, algebra, arithmetic and trig, and 1 for calculus 1 technique. So maybe they've forgotten U substitution. Maybe they're struggling with completing the square, something like that. They're going to get grades for all of those. And if they want to know how they did on the quiz, they just add those 4 grades together and divide by 4. And that's going to give them a grade on a 4.0 scale that they can interpret in the same way that they would interpret a GPA. There is a particular scale of points that says, you know, between 3.35 and 4 is considered an A in my class. It used to be 3.4 to 4, but the students got me to lower it to 3.35. So if the students have an average between 3.35 and 4, we would consider that an A. So in 7 to 10 quizzes throughout the semester, we assess 30 different standards. And if the student wants to know their score right now, they just add the scores together, add the scores together that they have, and then divide by the number of standards. Now, standards quizzes comprise 65 to 85% of the final grade in the course. Now, when I was teaching using standards-based grading face-to-face, it was 85% quizzes. And I felt that that was fair. But when the pandemic moved us all online, moved everyone home, I thought it was important that we emphasize homework more, because it's really important that the students do that homework so that they do well on these quizzes. So after the pandemic, I reduced the percentage weight for these standards quizzes from 85% to 65%. And then homework percentage is between 5 and 20%. It used to be 5% face-to-face, 5%, sometimes 10%, depending on the semester. And the final exam is always 15%. So all of these shift from semester to semester as I learn from my students and learn about what they feel is important and what I think they need as far as accountability is concerned, and as far as weighting is concerned, so that they will take the time to do the homework, take the time to study for the final exam, and so on. But that is generally how it breaks down. It's mostly quizzes. And there's also a differentiation mastery exam in Calculus 1 and an anti-differentiation mastery exam in Calculus 2. The ability to take a derivative is one of the most important skills that students take from Calculus 1, because if they can't take a derivative, they're going to have a lot of trouble in Calculus 2 and Calculus 3 and differential equations. They need to be able to compute derivatives efficiently and quickly and accurately. And so there is a differentiation mastery exam. It has 10 problems. The student has to get 9 out of 10 to pass, 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 to pass. I think 3 problems include the chain rule, and the other problems involve the product rule, the quotient rule, and just some other combination of basic rules. And the students can take that as many times as they want during office hours. And typically I have office hours 4 days a week, and often at least one evening a week. So the way that works is students, once they've learned all their derivative rules, which is about a month and a half into the semester, the students can take that differentiation exam up to 4 times per week for the rest of the semester until the week before finals week. So many times I will say to my students, you have 44, if you've got 11 weeks left in the semester, you have 44 more opportunities to take this exam. And there are 10 versions of the exam. So if you take it 11 times, you're going to see a quiz again. You're going to see some problems again. But the idea is that you need to get 9 out of 10. You need to be able to consistently take a derivative. And that's what the differentiation exam is for. Anti-differentiation mastery is very similar, but it's in Calculus 2, and it covers basic rules, U substitution, and integration by parts. Now, I use this in a number of courses. Starting in spring of 2016, I used this for the first time in a face-to-face Calculus 1 class. I read about standards-based grading on a blog in fall of 2015, and I just thought it was brilliant because it addressed so many of the issues that my calculus students face. They have issues with prerequisite deficiencies. They're extraordinarily hardworking. but they maybe haven't taken a math class in a while. Um, and this was allowing me to help them remediate all of the skills that they were lacking. Uh, it was helping me to remediate those skills and not permanently penalize them, and also not allow them to skip the problems that are just too hard because they don't have the skills. Instead, it allowed us all to focus on remediating the deficiencies so that they weren't deficiencies anymore. And then once we've remediated those deficiencies, to focus on the new material, and the new material that was the hardest. So that was in face-to-face Calculus 1 starting in spring of 2016. The next semester that I taught a face-to-face Calculus 2, I added standards-based grading to that. So I was using standards-based grading in Calc 1 and Calc 2. The following semester, I was using it in Calc 1, Calc 2, and Calc 3. And then the semester after that, I was using it in Calc 1, Calc 2, Calc 3, and differential equations. So I was writing about 7 to 10 quizzes per semester for the course. Plus, the first time I taught using standards-based grading in each of these courses, I was writing about 3 reassessment quizzes per standard. So there were about 100 quizzes per course the first semester I taught these, or taught these courses using standards-based grading. And then every semester, I always add a quiz or 2, sometimes 3. So for example, with trigonometric substitution, I believe there are like 12 versions of that quiz. So when a student is reassessing over a trigonometric substitution standard in Calculus 2, they would just come to office hours. I would print a quiz for them. Now, if the students have been collecting files, and you have to assume that they are collecting files and sharing them, I really don't mind, because if they're studying 12 different variations of that quiz, they're basically studying the problems that I want them to study. If they happen to get lucky and see one that they've studied before, that's totally fine with me. My goal is to see that they actually have this skill now. I'm not trying to trick anyone. So yeah, there are about a dozen of each of the types of quiz now, starting in spring 2016. This has been going on for about 5 years. And then I only used this standards-based grading in my face-to-face courses until spring of 2020, when the pandemic set us home. Before that, I would occasionally teach online, but my online courses were always taught using a traditional framework, because I felt that I was constrained by the fact that we had to use publisher materials. So there are 2 publishers that we tend to use at TCC. We use Pearson for our pre-calculus courses, and we use Cengage and WebAssign for our calculus courses. And our differential equations textbook is currently a Pearson textbook, so we use MyLab Math for that as well. But in online courses before the pandemic, I was using just a very traditional grading system. I was providing all the same notes. I was giving online homework as opposed to paper-based homework. We were doing online quizzes and tests as opposed to paper-based tests in most classes. For differential equations, I still did a paper-based test. But it was very different. So after the pandemic, or once that pandemic set in, I decided I needed to deliver on this promise. The students that had enrolled in my spring 2020 Calculus 1 class, it was an honors Calculus 1 class, and my face-to-face Calculus 3 class, were now taking Calculus 1 and Calculus 3 online for about a month and a half, when they weren't expecting to learn online that semester at all. Fortunately, I had already started creating a YouTube channel with videos of my lectures. I wasn't planning to do videos for Calculus 1 that semester, but I started doing videos for Calculus 1 at the very end of spring 2020. But I had planned to do videos for Calculus 2 and Calculus 3 that semester. So I just added Calculus 1 to the list of lectures that I needed to create and give at the end of spring 2020. And I started thinking, okay, I promised these Calculus 1 and Calculus 3 students standards-based grading, so how can I do this online? And what happened was I came up with an online Calculus 3 course. The textbook that we were using at the time in spring 2020 was a text that was hosted um, on the MyLab Math platform as far as the homework is concerned. Now we're using the Larson Calculus text, Early Transcendentals. And so our homework is now in WebAssign. But Online Calculus 1 and Online Calculus 3 were having, or suddenly had WebAssign or MyLab Math quizzes, so online quizzes, as opposed to the paper-based quizzes they were used to. And my students were also accustomed to taking a quiz approximately once a week and getting lots of written feedback from me on how to improve, and then just coming to office hours and taking a new quiz. I had to modify all of that. So suddenly I was writing lots of variations of these quizzes online, letting my students take the quiz a number of times, thinking that I didn't want to penalize someone for making an arithmetic mistake that led to the wrong answer, or even a small algebra mistake that led to the wrong answer, that led to that problem being completely wrong in WebAssign or MyLab Math, when the student really had a good understanding of the method, and they would have gotten a lot of partial credit had they been taking the same course face-to-face with the paper-based quizzes. I would be giving partial credit and assigning credit based on their understanding of the method, as opposed to the very strict accuracy that is required with something like MyLab Math or WebAssign. So I had to do everything very differently, and I'm going to save that for another video. In Online Calculus 3, I use WebAssign quizzes to do reassessment, and it's not the same as what I'm doing face-to-face. I wouldn't say that it is as good as what I'm doing face-to-face, but according to my Online Calculus 3 students, they'd rather do the WebAssign quizzes with reassessment opportunities than 4 or 5 paper-based exams or 4 or 5 unit exams. So based on feedback from students, I'm keeping that. And in my online differential equations class and that's online live differential equations class, I am still using the paper-based quizzes that I used face-to-face. I'm not using the reassessment quizzes anymore. I'm doing something totally different for reassessment in the online and online live differential equations class. But we are doing paper-based quizzes that I write that are very similar in format to the paper-based quizzes that I gave in the face-to-face differential equations before the pandemic. So I primarily use this in calculus and differential equations. I also use this for one semester at TU when I was a graduate student doing some research. TU's pre-calculus class is equivalent to TCC's pre-calculus 1 and pre-calculus 2. So it was a college algebra trig combo class, and I used standards-based grading there as well. So what is SBG? The standards are clearly articulated in what we call the standards document. Here is an image of the standards document, the very first page of the standards document in Calculus 2. So I want you to notice that there are 2 general standards, G1 and G2 in Calculus 2. So you've got an algebra, arithmetic, and trig prerequisite, and this lists in this paragraph everything that I expect them to know about arithmetic, algebra, and trig, with the exception of some just known facts about arithmetic with real numbers. I don't think I list that on here, but the students know that they need to be familiar with log properties and exponential properties, factoring, solving algebraic equations, all those techniques, graphing techniques. They need to understand transformations, X and Y intercepts, and all of that. And it's all listed here. So if there's anything on that list that they don't know how to do, they know that they can review it. And they also know that anytime they make those types of mistakes in Calculus 2, so that arithmetic, algebra, or trigonometry is preventing them from doing as well as possible in Calculus 2, I give them a grade for arithmetic, algebra, and trigonometry. And I say, hey, go back to trig, go back to your trig notes, and look at your right triangle identities or your reciprocal identities. And the students know to do that. Or if they have a Calculus 1 issue, like they're trying to solve, let's say, an improper integral, and they need to evaluate a limit. Well, that is a concept from Calculus 1. Students from Calculus 1 learn to compute limits at infinity and learn exactly what those mean. So the students need to know conceptual understanding of limits. They need to know L'Hopital's rule. They need to know how to evaluate limits algebraically, differentiation rules, and all of that. So if any of those skills are holding them back in Calculus 2, when they're taking a quiz over a different standard, a Calculus 2 standard, I will give them a grade for Calculus 1 and the algebra, arithmetic, and trig, and sort of tell them where they need to improve. And that grade is on a 0 to 4 scale, but every time you take a quiz, I write over it. So the old grade is gone and you get the new grade instead. So it's really just a feedback score that lets the student know where they're doing or how they're doing as far as their prerequisites are concerned and where they need to focus in order to improve. So they'll get grades for this, as well as the grades for Calculus 2. In Calculus 3, there are 3 prerequisite standards, G1, G2, and G3 for arithmetic, algebra, and trig, Calc 1 and Calc 2. And in differential equations, there are prerequisite standards for all of calculus and arithmetic, algebra, and trig. Now, in order to make this feasible for a teacher, and we do need to make this feasible because you have to deliver on whatever promises you made your students. You have to put some kind of limit on reassessment. Now you can limit the number of reassessments per standard. So for one semester, I said you can reassess on every topic once. But that was a bad idea. I actually had one student that came in and he wanted to take like 15 or 20 standards. I don't remember the exact number during finals week. And that really defeated the purpose of reassessment. You could also limit the students on the number of reassessments they can take per week. So I might say you can take 1 reassessment per week, or you can take 2 reassessments per week if I'm not teaching many classes using standards-based grading. So if I have a semester where I'm teaching a lot of algebra and only a little bit of calculus, I can allow my calculus and differential equation students to reassess over 2 standards a week because I know I can handle about 150 reassessments per week, and that's it. That's the maximum I can handle as far as grading those and getting them back to my students. Or you can make the limitations on reassessment time limited. So you might say within 2 to 3 weeks of the original quiz, you have the opportunity to reassess. It's really up to you. I tend to stay in this category with the number of reassessments per week. The students know that if there are 30 standards in the class and there are only 16 weeks in the semester, you're not going to have the opportunity to reassess over all 30 standards. There are some that you have to master the first time, or some grades that you're going to have to keep. But the idea is that when you do get a really low grade, because either you weren't ready for the quiz at the time that it was administered, or you really didn't understand it the first time, but now you've had an opportunity to look at it again and improve, those students will have the opportunity to improve on those standards. Okay, so this is the big question is why? Why would you do this? Why SBG? And I use standards-based grading because I believe it ties grades to evidence of actual learning. So this is just going over the rationale. The way I pitch this to my colleagues and the way I've always thought about it is, what does this C mean? If a student gets a C in a pre-calculus class, what exactly does that mean anyway? So here's an example. And let's say you've got 2 students, student number 1 and student number 2. And both students have an 87% on their homework, so that's fine. And student number 1 is taking a class where there are 3 exams. Like this might be the traditional pre-calculus class as it's taught at TU. Most faculty over there at the time that I was teaching it would administer exams with 3 exams throughout the semester. So the student gets a 72 on the first exam, a 69 on the second, a 68 on the third, and they get a high B for their homework grade. If you average all of those, that student gets a 74 in the class. They have a C. Student number 2 actually did much better on the exams. Exam 1 and 2, they aced them. We got a low A for exam 1 and a decent but low A for exam 2. And then the student bombed the third exam. But if you average those numbers together, you get a 75.25, and that person has a C. When we look at a student's transcript, we cannot tell the difference between student 1 and student 2. All these numbers tell us is that, well, maybe student number 1 is a C student. That's how well they're understanding the material. But does it tell you anything that they know about pre-calculus? Does it tell you what they need to study? Does it tell you, are they good at transformations of functions? How comfortable are they with that? How about right triangle trig? Do they know how to graph trigonometric equations? Do they know how to solve trigonometric equations, or I said trigonometric equations, trigonometric functions. Do they know how to graph trigonometric functions? Do they know how to solve trigonometric equations? Do they know how to solve equations involving rational functions? All of that is hidden in these numbers, this exam 1, exam 2, and exam 3. And the teacher might know. The person who wrote those exams might be able to say, well, those exam 1 covered this, and exam 2 covered this, and exam 3 covered this. And therefore, I know the student has deficiencies in some of these areas, but this 72 hides what the student is good at and what the student is not good at. It doesn't tell us anything about where the student can improve. It just puts a number on the student and says, you're a C student for this exam. You're a C student for that exam. And then we say, maybe exam 3 is comprehensive. Maybe it's the final. Say, oh, those things that you missed before, you should brush up on those because they're going to be on the final. Oh, well, the student got a 68 on the final. Actually, that's not how the structure is at TU. That the last final in pre-calculus is not comprehensive, or at least it wasn't the semester that I taught it with a traditional grading system like this. But still, there was really no incentive to go back and learn those things that the student didn't learn in the first place. Instead, the student missed them. If there was a problem that was too hard, the students often skipped them and they moved on to the next thing. But if that pre-calculus student is a STEM major, they're going to take those deficiencies into calculus 1. They're going to take those deficiencies into calculus 2. And unfortunately, deficiencies build upon deficiencies. And eventually they get to the point where they're not able to understand the big picture, like the meta perspective on these concepts, because they're bogged down in details that are really easy to clear up, especially if they had been cleared up at the very beginning. But these grades don't tell us anything. At least with student number 1, we can see that the student is a C student. That's their performance. They're a C student's performance, but I still don't have any idea what their skills are. Now, student number 2 looks like they had a bad day. Like they did great on exam 1 and exam 2. That is an A. They probably should have done more homework. They would have had a higher grade in the class if they had done more homework. But they had a really bad day with exam 3. Maybe someone died. Maybe something horrible happened, a pandemic, and all of a sudden you lost your job. You have to take care of your kids while you're studying. Like all kinds of things happen. But for whatever reason, this student bombed exam 3. Now, if these were grades from a traditionally graded pre-calculus class at TU, I would know exam 3 covers trig, and I would know the reason that student number 2 got a 30 on exam 3. Well, I can't tell you the reasons why they performed poorly, but I can tell you that they performed poorly on trig. So that C student that comes to your calculus 1 class has a lot of algebra skills. They did great in the algebra in exams 1 and 2, but they don't know trig. That student is in your class and they're sitting next to student number 1 in your class. If both of those are in your calculus 1 class, we need to help them differently. They have different needs. One student needs a trig review. This student needs review in other areas, which are completely hidden in these grades that are hovering around 70%. All these grades do is put a number on a student that doesn't really tell us anything about what the student knows. It tells us how to assign a grade at the end of the semester. And that may have been efficient in the past, and it's still efficient. It's much more efficient, I would say, than what I do right now. But I believe that it's less effective and less student-centered. I think that we can do better. So this 74 means a lot. This C, this 74 over here, or this C and this for this student, and this C for this student mean totally different things. But the numbers themselves don't tell us a story. They don't tell us how the student can improve. We have no idea what the student knows or what the student doesn't know. We don't know what the student needs to study for the final unless we look at the student's specific work, and we can, and we often do. And we don't know how to help that student improve their skills before calculus 1, if they're going on to calculus 1. So the idea with standards-based grading is like those grades that we were just looking at are not meaningful except for to assign a number to a student. Let's make our grades meaningful. Let's tie grades, which the students want so badly. They want high grades. Let's tie that to measures of actual learning. Let's say, like, here's a number that represents how much you understand on a specific topic. And we can do that as long as we have enough topics, because a unit exam might include 10 topics when we really mean to assess 10 different things. So why not assign 10 grades as opposed to 1 grade? So that's the idea. One of the reasons why I love standards-based grading is because of these before and after conversations with students. Obviously, this is anecdotal. This is not numerical results of a study, but let me just pose this for you. If you're a teacher and you're watching this, you can probably relate to this. You know, I was gone yesterday. Did I miss anything important? Yeah, you always miss something important. We always have that talk. Or how about this? Math students, oh, that problem is hard. Maybe it's a physics student, a science student. That problem is hard. I'm just going to skip that one. Or I only need 3 points to get a B, Miss Townsend. Is there anything that I can do to get those 3 points? The student comes to you with these questions, and you're like, oh man, but you deserve a C. Like your performance indicates that you deserve a C, that you haven't gotten to the good level of achievement in this course. You know, maybe, or maybe they really do deserve a B, and maybe the number of points that they've earned doesn't accurately measure their abilities. So these were the types of things that we would talk about before. We would talk about points, but it was points focused. It was focused on points that would lead to a certain goal, and the goal was a certain grade, and the grade was what the student would see on their transcript and what others would see on their transcript when someone was looking at that course being associated with that student. And it's perfectly natural and expected that the students would want to focus on that, because that is the concrete, almost tangible. I mean, it is tangible in the form of your transcript, version of like your performance in this course. But those grades aren't necessarily meaningful. So we said, okay, well, how can we make them meaningful? Let's assign grades to individual standards. After standards-based grading, in Calculus 1, I have this conversation with a student. I got a 2 on the mean value theorem. Why did I get a 2? I thought that was at least a 3. And so then we would have a conversation about the difference between a 2, which is a C, and a 3, which is a B. And we would say, okay, like 2 means you have enough understanding for this on this topic to go on to the next course. I'm comfortable with you going to the next course. You know this well enough to not be behind and to not be confused on the next course if the mean value theorem should come up again. But 3 is a good level of understanding. So let's talk about what makes a writing about the mean value theorem, because usually my students have to write a little bit of a paragraph about what the mean value theorem says and what it means, and then applying that theorem to solve a problem. Like, let's talk about what that might look like. So we'll have that conversation. Or the students in pre-calculus will say, I'm struggling with graphs of transformations. Can you show me what I'm doing wrong? Or how do I know when to use substitution versus integration by parts? Or I got a 1 on eigenvalue methods, and that's in differential equations. Can you show me what I'm doing wrong? So we're talking about topics. We're talking about math as opposed to talking about grades, but still we talk about grades occasionally. The student says, I have a C, but I really want a B. What can I do to get a B in this class? That conversation still happens, but when it happens, now rather than saying, okay, here's this assignment that will give you 5 points, we're saying, what do you need to learn that will serve you on the final, that will serve you in your next class, that will allow you to turn your C into a B? Now, the following grades are grades from a real TU pre-calculus student shared with that student's permission. The day that they were taken, the student had a 4.0 average. The student had a standards average of 2.67. And a 2.67 is close to a B. At the time at TU, I was using 2.75 to 3.4 to represent a B in that class. That was the point totals that earned a B in that class that semester. And so the student is wondering, how can I bring this 2.67 up to a 2.75 so that I have a B on my standards? Well, it's easy to just look at the grade book and say, okay, well, where are the low grades? We got 4 1s here, 4 1s. The student is struggling with exponential functions, logarithmic functions, laws of logarithms, and solving logarithmic equations and exponential equations. If the student were to bring up 2 of those, if she earned 3s on 2 of those rather than 1s, her new standards average would be 2.8 and she would be in the B range. And that's great because if she's going on to Calculus 1, she needed to learn about exponential and logarithmic functions anyway. So she and I would have a conversation. We actually did have a conversation about which of these topics are most important for Calculus 1 and are likely to come up again in Calculus 1 and 2 and throughout the rest of the sequence. This student was a STEM major. And so we talk about what's most important for future classes and also would be likely to appear on the final. And then she was able to study for those and bring up those grades. So now I have these numbers and I'm still assigning a number to a student based on their time limited performance, a snapshot of how they understood that material at the time that they took that quiz. But now when I see that number associated with something, it's associated with a topic. And it says, this student doesn't have a good understanding of exponential functions. Let's work on that. And we're able to work on that. So here's a snapshot of the grade book. What's great about this is that if you are talking to a student and they want to know how they're doing in the class, the row tells you how that student is doing. So you can focus on a row and you can see, well, anywhere there are low grades, that will draw my focus. And that tells me that's where the student has room to improve. Or maybe they missed a quiz and they have a bunch of zeros. Then you focus on those zeros and say that's where the student has room to improve. The columns, though, are also very insightful. My students really had struggled, with graphing logarithmic functions. It had been a while since I taught that, and I apparently did not do a very good job. It was hard. It was hard for them the first time that they had ever learned about logarithms and see the grades are 1s and 2s, and I've got an occasional 3. But this tells me that my whole class struggled with that. I might even choose to put the F19 standard on another quiz to let the entire class reassess because the entire class didn't get it very well. And I also know that I need to review that content in class. So if my students are struggling with this or they're struggling with this, and I can look at the column and see that my class is struggling with a concept, I know that I should focus on that material more and give the students more opportunities to assess and also just review the material with them, both one-on-one and in class. Now, this involves writing lots of quizzes, as I've mentioned. So many times people will ask me, why would you do this to yourself? And the reason that I do this to myself is because my students learn. It's absolutely worth it to me to do the work because I see the progress and I get to celebrate my students' success. And that is a wonderful thing. So let's talk about how this works when it works well. And this is, again, talking primarily about standards-based grading in the face-to-face environment. I'm going to talk about how I translated SBG to the online environment in another video. So in the face-to-face environment, the way it worked was this. I would teach them. That's an opportunity to learn. Then they would practice in class with their classmates. Then they would take an assessment. So they would take a quiz. And then I would give them feedback, detailed feedback, and they would practice more based on the feedback, based on conversations with me. They'd often practice with their classmates, and then they would have the opportunity to reassess, and we would repeat that. So you'd learn, you'd practice, you'd assess, then you'd practice, and then you'd reassess, and you'd repeat. And we would do this over and over again all semester long. So we would learn through lectures. There were discussions. I also had supplemental videos. The videos weren't required. It wasn't a flipped classroom, but the videos were there as detailed examples and detailed discussions of the concepts and techniques I wanted my students to master so that when I was going through this material in class and I was under time constraints because I only have an hour and 50 minutes in each calculus class, my students could go home and watch a detailed video where I show them everything step by step, the types of problems that they're likely to see on the quizzes, why we're doing what we're doing. When in class, I have to go through relatively quickly and I have to talk about an overview of this topic, but I could get into the details and take my time when I made a video, which makes the videos long, but the fact that they're long is a consequence of the fact that I'm not leaving anything out. So the students have the opportunities to learn through the lectures, which is like the Cliff Notes version. of the material where I'm talking about the big picture and then talking about, basically how we solve these problems, and we're doing examples. And they also have the opportunities to learn from in-class discussions and videos when they had the supplemental videos when I was teaching face-to-face. And then once we went online due to the pandemic, they're using the videos as their primary source of content in our course. Now with the face-to-face class, after lecture, I would usually lecture for the first hour in an hour and 20-minute differential equations class. The last 20 minutes, there would be in-class cooperative learning. So there were relays at the board where there was not one student who was able to take over the problem. Everybody had to do a step. You had to pass the marker to other people in the group, and then you had to articulate what you were doing and why you were doing it. So the students were getting really good at communicating about math and got accustomed to working together and sharing that problem solving and explaining things to each other. And you'd find that because they're explaining things to each other, they're learning so much more. They're learning through teaching. And we would do that for the last 20 minutes of class. Sometimes we wouldn't finish the problem. Often a group would finish the problem and they'd get to go home early. That was their pass to get out of class, was to finish the differential equation early. But we'd learn through a lecture, and then we would apply what we learned in a group setting together, not for points, just for the opportunity to practice. And then what would typically happen in the face-to-face environment before the pandemic was that study groups would form organically. Now I had 10 office hours per week, and I would do all of my office hours in the math lab at TCC. That's our math and science tutoring center. So I would sit at a little desk in the back of the math lab, and my students used to take over this table in the corner next to a giant whiteboard, and they were like, that's our table. And they would go in, and like my students were just taking over this table and taking over the whiteboard. And at that whiteboard, they would just camp out in the math lab, and they'd be there for hours. They were explaining problems to each other in much the same way that they were explaining problems to each other in class. And whenever they needed help, whenever they got stuck, they just came to the back of the lab. They came to my little desk and they were like, Miss Townsend, what's this? And I'm like, you don't need that missing DX. You should try a U substitution. And then I would just give them a tip. And then they would go back to their group and they'd say, oh, Miss Townsend said this. And so they would keep working. And when the whole group was confused, they'd say, Miss Townsend, and I would just go over to the desk and I would help them all with a problem at the whiteboard. Or sometimes if they were getting the wrong answer, I'd come over at the whiteboard and I'd bring a different colored marker and I would mark it up like I was marking up a paper and say, this was good, but here, that you missed that should have been a plus sign and you forgot to bring this T down. And I would just correct their work on the spot in class, or not in class, in the math lab. And they would typically erase it and start over again and work together towards solving more problems. And so that would happen. They were camping out in the lab, explaining problems to each other, asking me for help when they needed help. And then when the student felt ready, after asking me for help on the problems, often asking me for additional example problems, other problems to work just for practice, and asking for feedback on that before taking a reassessment quiz. When the student felt ready, they would come in and they'd say, I'm ready for a reassessment over this particular topic. I would print a quiz over that particular topic, and they would take it, and then I would take it back and I would grade it and I would give it to them the following week. So as this happened, students are watching their grades improve and they're studying more. So it's just a wonderful thing. I remember the first time it happened, there was a girl that I was talking to about this, or a young woman that I was talking to about this, a college student. And I remember the first time, I think she turned her 1 into, I think it was a 1 into an A. I don't remember the details anymore very well, but I tell this story a lot, but she's like, the look on her face was just shocked. Like when her grade went from like a 1 to a 4 or a 1 to a 3, I forget what the range was, but it jumped a lot. And she said, you mean all I had to do is study? And I was like, yes, all you have to do is study. All you have to do is study and learn, and watch as you study and learn, your grade goes up. And then they're like, oh, that feels really good. And then they studied some more and their grade would go up some more, and they would study some more and their grade would go up some more. And so it was just this wonderful, beautiful thing as the students are watching their grades improve. but what's really improving that grade is all of the work that they're doing. This is not a magic grading system that magically allows everybody to learn math. Uh, it it is magical in the sense that it creates these communities, this sense of family, but um, it does not magically allow people to learn calculus by osmosis. It's the work that the students do to improve that helps. And it's this incentive structure, um, the structure that is provided by the standards-based grading system that really helps the students to learn math. So you might say, okay, well, what is the role of faculty in this? Well, first, you're the course designer. So you are setting the goals for the students. So you're saying, okay, with the course content, and we've got 4 units of content, here's core content at your institution. These are the things you're supposed to teach. You're like, what is the most important thing that we're teaching here? Is this about a technique or is this about a concept? Or is it more important that they understand the concept here, or is it the technique, or is it both? And once I have articulated those goals for the students, those go into the course standards document. And in the course standards document, I'll tell them, with this standard, I need you to be able to explain to me what the existence and uniqueness theorem for IVPs for featuring first order differential equations is. I need you to tell me what that theorem says. And then once you've told me what it says, I want you to apply it to solve a problem. So you'll set those goals for the students. And those goals may be different from the publisher's goals. They may be different from the textbook author's goals. They may be even different from your colleagues' goals. Everyone's going to be a little different. But when you clearly articulate those in a document for the students, it's just a form of backwards design, and it makes everything much better if you set those goals and then create everything with those goals in mind for the students' learning. As the course designer, after setting the goals, you are the person that creates the alignment. So you're creating the lessons or the lectures where they receive that content. You are creating the activities where they practice, which in my face-to-face classes was often board work. And then you're creating the assessments, and in my case, reassessments. So everything has to be tightly aligned, and it's easy to tightly align everything when you have 30 very specific goals for what you want your students to learn and what you want your students to get out of that class. So that's your first role, and it happens way before you meet any students. So there's that. Your second role is to be a coach and a mentor and a guide. I've seen myself as a coach and a mentor and a guide for years as a professor. It's not about being a sage on a stage. It's not about wearing jackets with like really cool elbow patches. Like that's great, but I don't have any jackets with elbow patches. My goal, or my role, or the biggest part of my role after being a course designer, is to coach my students and to mentor them and to guide them as they try to learn the material. So in addition to being a coach, I'm also their cheerleader. So I'm saying, yes, well done. That's awesome. Congratulations. That's great. Good. Like, I mean, there are exclamation points and like positive statements all over my students' papers. And then I'm also helping the student plan how to improve. So when I am grading that work, I'm saying, that was good. That was good. Oh, but you're missing a DX here. Oh, don't forget your plus C. Let's work on this notation. Or you have the right idea, but you're using the wrong word here. That's not a differential equation. That's the right-hand side of the differential equation. And so we're talking about how to get better and how to improve in much the same way that a basketball coach or a coach in some other field would coach you. They're saying, so this is really good. This is really good. And you want to keep your team motivated, right? So you want to tell them what they're doing well, but then you also want to say, here's some room for improvement. And here are some ways that you can improve. Let's try to do it. And so as a coach and a mentor and a guide, I'm doing that all the time. And lastly, we have to be subject matter experts. If you are a professor, you should know your subject. You should know your subject well. Hopefully more, you should know your subject better than the majority of your students. And that's not about ego. That's not about me or the professor saying like, ooh, I'm an expert. That's not what it's about at all. It's, you're the one who writes the quizzes. You're the one who should be able to coach them and give them good feedback if the students know more than you, well, then they probably shouldn't be learning from you. They should probably be learning from someone else who knows more than they do. Um, so your job, or part of our job as faculty, is to help our students understand the content. So hopefully you understand the content well enough to pass it on to your students. And then you have to know the content well enough, and you have to know the notation and the terminology and the reasoning well enough to provide detailed feedback for your students about the material. But I would say that subject matter expert, that's the last thing in our role as faculty. This is not about being just, somebody with a PhD or somebody with a master's degree that has an enormous amount of knowledge and just passes that knowledge on to other people. That's not what being a professor is anymore, at least not when we're doing it well. Um, it's designing a learning experience and then being by their side and helping the students to achieve. I always say that teaching is not about my performance, although my performance is involved, obviously, but it's about my students' performance. At the end of the semester, it's not about how well I can do math, because hopefully I can do math when I walk in. It's about how well my students can do math at the end of the semester. And if I've done my job well, my students are getting better and better all the time. So that's the faculty role. The students are learning what to study and how to study when we use standards-based grading. They're learning that they can learn challenging material. And they also find out that if they thought they could memorize quiz keys, because I give them access to old quiz keys or solutions to problems, they find out pretty quickly that that's not going to work. I give them quiz keys because I want them to know what's coming. I want them to know what's expected of them, but it's not enough to memorize a key. You actually have to understand the concept in order to earn an A on these quizzes. So students usually find that out pretty quickly. And they also find out that they can get the grade they want if they learn the material. And that's a really exciting aha moment to be a part of, when that student finally realizes that all they have to do is study and learn. And that's a hard thing to do. But if they have the time and they're willing to invest themselves and they really want to learn it, they can learn it. So I love SBG because it allows me to have high standards. I don't feel bad about having a very high standard on something, because I know that if the students do poorly, they have the opportunity to improve. They have the opportunity to try again. It sets clear expectations, and the student knows exactly where they stand. The grade book tells them where they stand. It gives the students opportunities to learn from feedback and learn from mistakes. It teaches growth mindset, and you're going to have some growth mindset talks as a professor, but it's teaching that growth mindset. And it's helping our students to become gritty, in the sense that they're pushing through, they're being tenacious, they're being responsible, they're innovating in order to learn how to learn and improve their performance in the class. Okay, so there are some challenges to all of this. When I first started doing this, I had to have reassessment sign up. So there were sign up sheets for reassessments. I had a Google Doc where students would sign up. And over time, students got uncomfortable putting their name on this document, which could be accessed by other students, and saying which standards they wanted to reassess over. So we had to come up with another system. Eventually, that was 2016, but over the course of years and years, that changed. Back in 2016, I only had 3 reassessment quizzes per standard in Calculus 1. And as the semesters went on and on and on, I had more and more reassessments in my bank of reassessments. So toward the end there, I was just printing out reassessment quizzes that I had already written. But since I had about 12 reassessments per standard, I didn't feel bad about that, because I knew that even if the students had access to old reassessment quizzes, they were studying basically 12 of them. They were going to have a lot of different reassessments to study from. And that's just like going through the textbook and picking up problems to practice. I'm totally fine if they practiced in order to get ready for that reassessment. But the first semester you do this, you're going to have to come up with some kind of sign up process where the students will tell you in advance which quizzes they want to take. And then you prepare those quizzes for them, and then they can come into your office and take them. Another logistical issue is writing quizzes and more quizzes. Like I said earlier in the video, I wrote about 100 quizzes per course the first time I taught each of these courses. So I had about 100 for Calc 1, Calc 2, Calc 3, and differential equations. And then about 100 for the pre-calculus at TU, which was a sort of college algebra trig combo class. All of that, excuse me, takes time. And because you have to be wary about reusing quizzes, especially at the very beginning, you have to keep writing more quizzes. I got really good at writing math problems. It's easy to see what is comparable variations on a theme, like you change out sine of x with cosine of x, you change out 3x with a 5x is 7x. You change out the polynomial that's multiplying the trig function with your integration by parts problems, for example. So it was very easy for me over time to write quizzes and write them quickly. I'm not just pulling problems from textbooks, I'm noticing the overall structure of a problem and then just writing these quizzes that are comparable as far as difficulty level are concerned. But it takes time to write all of those quizzes. And then you have to grade all of those quizzes, which is why the reassessment restrictions are so important. You can only reassess on 1 a week or 2 a week. You have the students do that, or you tell them they can only reassess for 3 weeks after the original quiz, or you say that you can reassess this many times on each standard in the course. You have to do something like that in order to make it feasible. If you say you can reassess as many times as you want over all of these topics, then a lot of people would be taking quizzes when they're not ready for them, and their grades would not be so good. Another thing that I will say, I should have put this in the slides, is that when students are doing reassessments in my class, the highest or the most recent grade stands. So the most recent grade on a reassessment is the student's grade. So the student does not want to take a reassessment quiz unless they feel confident, unless they feel like they can do better this time than they did last time. And that's a great thing. It prevents people from taking quizzes before they're ready. If students do take quizzes before they're ready, that's usually they only do that once. It's a learning opportunity, and they realize pretty quick that if their grade went down when they took a quiz, they're going to have to reassess over that one again next week. And they don't want that to happen. So we do talk about that in class. Sometimes the students have to learn once the hard way. But after they learn, you are only taking, or you're only grading reassessments for students that actually are prepared for the reassessment in the first place. And you have to administer these quizzes. For the first semester or two, I sent the quizzes to the testing center. But then another faculty member also started doing it. And then the testing center said, okay, there's too many students. They had all of my students and all of this other faculty member students. And it was just too much. So they stopped. So I started administering my quizzes during office hours, which made my office hours very busy. And I have to print all of those quizzes out, and I'm often taking questions at the same time and then looking around the math lab and making sure everybody is doing what they're supposed to do. And that typically works. I can do it. It can be done. But yeah, just like any other administration of an assessment, you have to keep your eyes on the students to help keep them honest. And of course, there are issues with academic integrity and test security with all of these reassessment quizzes, and how ubiquitous our printers and scanners have become. And especially after the pandemic, all the students know that they can use their phone as a scanner. You have to assume that all of those files that the students are sharing with you, they are very likely sharing with each other. So you have to be sure that if you are reusing quizzes, you don't mind that the students would all have access to those quizzes, because maybe they have access to them and they're using them for practice. But at the very beginning, when you first start doing this, you want to be very wary about reusing quizzes. and you want enough variations on the theme so that students can't share the quiz questions with each other. So all of those are important issues. Now, none of this works unless the students understand why we're doing what we're doing. If they think that this is some magical grading system that's going to make it easy for them to learn calculus by osmosis, they're wrong, and they're going to be disappointed, and their expectations are going to be really high, and they're going to be really sad when they find out that this is much harder than they expected. So you have to have talks about growth mindset. You have to talk about why we're doing what we're doing. They have to know that taking quizzes over and over is not going to help them learn. Mindless repetition doesn't help anybody learn anything, but focused repetition, where you are figuring out what's going right and figuring out what's going wrong and noticing the mistakes that you're making and the patterns that you tend to fall into, like, that's helpful. That's very helpful. If we focus on one skill or one course standard at a time, and then we improve those mistakes and we correct deficiencies from previous courses, it feels really good when you get that new grade. And there's a snowballing effect. You get one positive grade, or you get one very high grade, and then after that you get another one, and then another one, and then another one, and the students are learning how to learn. And that's just a beautiful, wonderful thing. Again, you have to have realistic expectations. This is not an easy A. This is not just, oh, I don't have to learn it. I've got time, because eventually at the end of the semester, the student's not going to have time anymore. So, reassessments or core standards that you have to reassess over will pile up. So I don't want the students to think this is an easy A, but it is a system that will help them and incentivize them to study and learn if they take advantage of that system. And finally, you have to realize that some people are never going to understand this system, and you can't take it personally. If there are viral misconceptions about this, they will affect the students' learning. You have to talk to the students about what we're doing and why we're doing it. And if you hear, some rumor that it's going to be easy, that you can just memorize the quiz key or something like that, you kind of have to nip it in the bud. You have to talk about it and say, actually, memorizing the quiz key doesn't work. The students who have tried to do that in the past get really disappointed, and they feel really frustrated. There are no shortcuts here, but there are incentives and benefits to doing things right the first time. And smaller bites of material are going to enhance our learning without sacrificing rigor. In education jargon, we call this reducing cognitive load. So if you were to take a Unit 1 exam and say differential equations, that Unit 1 exam covering introduction to differential equations and first order differential equations would cover 10 course standards, rather than having a single unit exam that is intended to cover 10 different topics in a sort of surfacey way. And then we give a percentage grade that says, this is how much you know about Unit 1. Instead of doing that, we are saying, this is how much you know about this topic, and then this topic, and then this topic. And we give the student 10 topics or 3 different quizzes that cover those 10 topics. And each time they're getting specific feedback on their understanding on those 10 individual things. And then the student has the opportunity to say, I really didn't understand that. I need to fix that. And so then they can go and fix that. So this is not sacrificing rigor. This is sort of making our course modular, and anytime we need a standard that connects concepts, that is a standard that goes into my list of course standards. I will have students classify differential equations by type and choose the appropriate method, because those are techniques and skills that the students need to have. But getting the material in smaller bites, where they only have 2 to 4 standards to study for at a time, is actually enhancing learning. It's not making things worse or breaking it into too many pieces. It's actually making the course a lot better. So again, consistent with all of this, they have to understand why. So I have to pitch it to my students, and this is how I pitch it to my students. I put this mug from Game of Thrones. It may be a little dated at this point, but I love the quote, "I drink and I know things." I'm referring to coffee, of course. Like I have my moon mug right here. I drink a lot of coffee, but yeah, we drink coffee and we know things. The whole purpose and point behind this is that the students would know what they need to know so that they succeed in future classes. So when they go to the university, most of my students are going to transfer to OSU Tulsa and major in mechanical engineering. Just the majority of my students in calculus 1, 2, 3 and differential equations are in that boat. Our goal is for them to be prepared for OSU's 3000 level engineering analysis class. If an engineering analysis professor does some derivation on the board and it involves a lot of calculus, it has a triple integral in it and it involves some integration and all of that, I want my students to be able to follow along without missing a beat. I want them to be able to focus on the engineering and the engineering analysis rather than getting bogged down in details that they should have learned in previous classes. So my students know that I am trying to prepare them for the big university, and that's why they take my class, even though it's hard. So some things that I say to them are, this is going to be a lot of hard work, but if you do the work, I'll work hard and you'll work hard, you're going to learn. Or if you study the materials that I provide for you, including quiz keys, including notes, including worked example problems, and you listen to the feedback that I give you, you read the feedback and then ask about it if it doesn't make sense, you're going to learn this material and your grades are going to reflect that. All you have to do is take a reassessment and show me that you've learned it and your grade goes up, which is pretty cool. The next thing that I might say is that it's okay to make a mistake. If you have a bad day, you don't understand it, you know, my students were making fun of me about this. I would say, don't stress, reassess. And they didn't really think that that was helping them reduce their stress levels. But the idea is, if you don't know something in time for the quiz, it's okay. This arbitrary quiz deadline is not like the deadline for learning all things for all time. Like you can learn it later. It's totally fine if you don't know it now. It's okay to make a mistake. But remember, our goal is for you to understand this material by the end of the semester. And the sooner you understand the material, the better, because the material in this course builds on itself. So it's okay if you get a bad grade. It's temporary. It's potentially temporary as long as you learn from your mistakes. But we want to learn from our mistakes as soon as possible because that'll make the rest of the course easier. And I joke, I kid, but I don't kid. I say, everyone's going to want to study with you, because it's true. When you actually know what you're doing, everyone's like, can you be in my study group? And that's generally how that works. And finally, and this is all over my syllabus, I always say that if you go to OSU or another university, you're going to want to know what you're doing. You do not want to be in over your head when you get to the university. You do not want to have to relearn calculus 1, calculus 2, calculus 3, and differential equations and all of the important content and algebra and trig. You don't want to have to learn all of that while you're learning engineering analysis. You want to have the algebra skills to keep up with the place that you're going, where you want to go. So this system is designed so that if you do all of this work, you will correct the deficiencies, you will know the math that you're supposed to know, and then when you get to the university, you're going to be able to keep up just fine, and you won't be distracted by the math because it will be something that you know. It'll be in your long-term memory, and you'll be able to focus on things like engineering and applied math. So that is the end of this video. In another video, I will talk to you about the challenges of implementing standards-based grading during a pandemic. And there are a lot of challenges in taking what I did face-to-face, which worked so well and was such a seamless, beautiful experience for my students. And then taking that and doing it online with online homework platforms and Zoom and using scanning apps for our work and trying to administer all of those quizzes and give students opportunities for reassessment while they're learning from home. So thank you for your attention. If you stayed all the way till the end, I will see you next time.